much move. Your sons and daughters have to leave. Your rivers flow to the shore, taken deep into the big blue sea. Your trees are stripped and slain, oil and gas for foreign
I'd like
gain.
to welcome everybody here today to Connolly Books. My name's Janelle. I'm a member of Connolly Youth Movement and I'll be chairing this afternoon's event. So we're here today to explore the underlying causes of the current refugee situation under the theme Permanent War and Permanent Refugee Crisis. And we have two speakers lined up for you today who will be examining these in more detail, and they are Micheal MacAonghusa and Clare Daly. And after they've both given their speech, then there'll be an opportunity for any questions from the audience. Okay, so our first speaker is translator, editor and freelance journalist Micheal MacAonghusa. Micheal is a member of the National Executive Committee of the Communist Party of Ireland and founder editor of the Socialist Voice, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of Ireland. In the past, Micheal has also been editor of the weekly Irish language paper Anish and director of Oireachtas na Gaeilge National Festival. He has been an active campaigner for the rights of Irish speakers for many decades, and in addition to this, Micheal has been active with the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign and has visited Palestine as part of the Solidarity delegation. Okay, so I'd like to hand over to you, Micheal, if that's okay?
Right, yeah. Dúirlumm go gaith mé fanacht me hí ar bhaile leis an gamra. De hic mé raibh me íomhá go tábhachtach sin agus go súil go bhfuil. Michael Noonan referred some time ago to Irish immigration as being a lifestyle choice. Now, large-scale immigration or migration of any kind is never a lifestyle choice. And yet states, politicians, right-wing agitators, and dare I say, many mainstream media communicators talk about refugees from war as if they had any choice. If you bomb people's towns, wipe out their livelihood and obliterate their hope for a future in their own country, it's a bit much blaming them when they arrive on your doorstep, pleading for some sort of sanctuary. President Obama, in his address to the United Nations on Monday, said there would have been no revolt in Syria if Syria was a democratic country. Who is rebelling violently in Syria against the government there? Fundamentalist Islamists of different hues. Who armed them and encouraged them to attack the Syrian state? The Pentagon. There's a White House doctrine since the days of Bush Sr. that it's permissible to create insurrection in any country which does not comply with the American definition of freedom, which means, of course, adherence to US foreign policy and facilitation of neoliberal economics. When necessary, the people who implement this sort of doctrine will wage war anywhere they like, and waging war for them is a continuous method of work. It's not a matter of reacting to crisis, it's more a matter of maintaining a permanent state of armed conflict across an increasing number of theatres. When necessary, they will orchestrate what they call regime change. And let us not forget that it was in Europe we had one of the worst examples of regime change when a fascist-led coup, sponsored primarily by the European Union, overthrew the constitutional government of Ukraine. The warlords don't do this for fun, or they don't do this because as individuals they have an insatiable thirst for blood. They do it to ensure the expansion and profitability of capitalism. Much of the world is being devastated at the moment by wars, many of which are not widely reported in the West. The wars in Africa and the constant efforts to create civil war in South America do not figure in our daily diet of television and newspaper coverage. We do know well that Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria have been utterly destroyed by wars initiated, pursued, and financed by the United States in particular, but also Britain, the European Union, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. All sorts of weird and wonderful groups, including Islamic fundamentalists, have been set up covertly by these powers to destroy and destabilize existing states and to cause deliberate havoc, allowing the imperialists to walk in and take over. The Western media has been jumping up and down for some time about the horrible ISIS, and it is horrible, but never tells us that ISIS was trained and armed by the United States, just as what is now Al-Qaeda was originally set up as an anti-Soviet force in Afghanistan, and Islamists were encouraged by Israel in their opposition to secular resistance. Of course, the imperialists and their hangers-on are not getting it all their own way. Political and armed resistance is growing, often in forms unique to a particular territory. The algebraic theory of defining allies, what I call the algebraic theory of defining allies, in other words, my enemies' enemies are my allies. That comes into play very often and not always sensibly. Puppet regimes have been set up in Baghdad, Kabul, and Tripoli. They were never intended to govern or even administer in the interests of their own peoples. And in the last year, they have lost the allegiance of their countrymen and also lost control over most of their own territory. And they're under constant attack, even in their citadels. In Afghanistan, the Taliban was beaten back, but now they control most of the country because Afghans prefer them to the bombing and massacre committed daily by imperialist troops. And American, British, and Dutch warlords are being put to the pins of their collars to hold on to Kabul. The daily strategic bombing of Afghan territory by NATO is an indication of desperation. And strategic bombing means bombing whole areas of towns and cities, regardless of who the casualties are, and destroying an area completely, rather just targeting military objects. It only figures in the news here when there are non-Afghan casualties, such as last night when an MSF hospital in Kunduz with 109 patients and 80 staff was bombed by the Americans. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, including Bedouin, Druze, and Christian communities, is being pursued ruthlessly by Israel, not just militarily, but by the continuous creation of racist colonial settlements in the occupied territories. It seems that it was Eisenhower or somebody close to him who coined the description military-industrial complex. That's that part of capitalism which profits most directly from war and preparation for war. These are the arms manufacturers and dealers who go into rapturous excitement over new and expensive wars. They have arms fairs all over the developed world, sponsored by governments with attendances of officers from practically all state armies in the world. They have no regrets about selling their wares to opposing sides. The biggest arms dealer in the world today is the State of Israel. The Israelis can boast that their products have all been field tested, as they say. And that is true. They were well tested in last year's invasion of Gaza. The children there are being brought up in what is a laboratory for aggressive war against communities. And the field testing is ongoing, with over 300 breaches by the Israelis of last year's ceasefire. On top of this, the blockade of Gaza is aimed at preventing the rebuilding of homes, schools, hospitals, factories, and roads destroyed by high-tech weapons. The total world expenditure on arms last year, 2014, was $1,744 billion, of which $610 billion was paid by the American taxpayer. The biggest increase in military spending in any single country was in Saudi Arabia, with an increase of 17% over 2013. There hasn't been a single year since 1945 when imperialist countries have not been involved in war. And I don't mean the cold kind, although the Cold War was often a hot one in the guise of proxy wars. Ever since the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, the direct use of their own ground forces has been avoided by the big powers. Part of the reason is that it's not considered cost effective anymore, but also because large numbers of casualties create opposition to war in the imperialist metropoles. So they get other people, mercenaries and various rebellious groups, to do their dirty work on the ground. The one thing they have to do themselves is the aerial bombing, because it costs billions of dollars. The aerial bombing, which often wipes out their own supporters on the ground as well as the targeted communities. To make it worse, there are all sorts of political power plays in operation at the same time. In the last week, the French have greatly increased their number of bombing sorties in Syria. The French always regard Syria and Lebanon as their zone of influence, and they dislike the idea of their English-speaking allies taking their place. To borrow a phrase, the French Empire never went away, you know. The core issue, in fact, of French foreign policy, which is really colonial policy still, is to hold on to the whole of Central Africa and its puppets there. And on Wednesday, the Russian Parliament approved the use of bombers in Syria, which has been going on for some time anyway. They are on the side of the Syrian government and army. But on Thursday, we learned that the Americans and Russians have come to an agreement not to get in each other's way in their bombing missions. Now, at this stage, if you're not confused, you haven't been paying attention. There are elements in the Turkish ruling class, and particularly in the current regime in Ankara, who still regret the loss of the Ottoman Empire. And they too would like to renew their old colonial possession of Syria, Lebanon. For generations, the Turks have been trying to wipe out Kurdish resistance, creating a buffer zone. Commentators close to the Turkish government speak openly of the desirability of creating a buffer zone in the north of Syria, cleansed of people and villages. This is music to the ears of the EU leaders and their military, who would like to have a sanitized belt between them and any anti-imperialist resistance in Syria. And such an arrangement would help to keep pesky refugees out of Europe. The United States managed to get a significant part of the Kurdish nation to support it against Saddam Hussein. Not surprising when you realise how badly they were treated by Saddam. But they managed to get that in return for a measure of home rule in northern Iraq in a situation of proxy war again. And the Israelis, followed by the British, were brought in to train the Kurds. But of course, the US continued to supply weapons to the Turks to attack the Kurds. In the past 2 months, Ankara has been boasting about its bombing of ISIS-held areas in Syria, but only a small percentage of sorties have been aimed at ISIS. The majority of them have relentlessly bombed all Kurdish areas in northern Syria. And of course, it is Israel which is the master of power play in the Middle East. They already have compliant governments in Amman and Cairo, and to a lesser extent in Beirut. Israel would love to be surrounded by total devastation, with Arab governments suppressing whatever resistance is left. Special forces of the US and Britain are carrying out killing operations in Syria, along with Saudi ground forces and armoured cars. And that beacon of the free world, Saudi Arabia, is carrying out a Gaza-style siege of Yemen, using starvation of the civilian population as a weapon, while tanks and forces from the United Arab Emirates have devastated the main cities. Capitalism is in one of its cyclical crises, probably its worst ever, and looking for ways out. Part of that programme is the imposition of austerity worldwide, but not, of course, on the ruling classes and their pals who are getting richer and richer. Another part of the same programme involves destroying productive forces not under the control of the major powers, mainly by war, in order to rebuild them afterwards at a profit. And of course, in the last 20 years, quite a number of Irish developers have profited from the rebuilding of areas which have been destroyed in such a way. Remember Jacques Delors speaking approvingly 20 years ago of the resource wars of the 21st century. He was actually calling on the EU to be ready to play its part in such adventures. What is amazing is not the number of refugees coming to Europe from the war zones, but the numbers who are holding on, some resisting and others just hoping for respite. Much of the population of Syria, over 4 million out of 17 million, has been dislocated, and a further 200,000 have been directly rendered homeless by bombing. A large number have had to flee their local areas, and many are in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. On top of that, the economy of the country has been reduced by 90%. The situation in the camps in the bordering countries is dire. The camps are full, and those who have not been able to get a place are given food vouchers. But the World Food Programme has significantly reduced the amount of food vouchers because of the lack of funds. And the value of the vouchers that are still being given out have been cut by about 50% since the beginning of this year. The World Food Programme needs to raise $26 million per week to meet the needs of the people depending on it in Syria and in camps just outside its borders. The total current humanitarian budget for the world is $19.52 billion, but so far only $7.15 billion has been raised from international donors. The word crisis is too mild to describe that situation. In August, the World Health Organization had to close down 184 health clinics in Iraq, a country that has seen severe fighting and massive internal displacement. The cuts have left 3 million people without access to healthcare. Those with a little bit of money in Syria and elsewhere, usually the better educated, are moving in big numbers to Europe. On arrival in Europe, most of them face being regarded as criminals and being interrogated aggressively and being virtually imprisoned. And it should be said that the conduct of the Irish state and its functionaries in this area is disgraceful, and the direct provision system is something we should all be ashamed of. People are refugees because their homelands are being devastated by war. They deserve a welcome, and they deserve what we all have a right to: a job, a home and a decent education. but there would be no refugees if there was no war. What we can do is to demand a foreign policy which will oppose the imperial warmongers and withdraw collaboration from them. And that means withdrawing the facility of Shannon Airport from the bombers and all war-making forces. Dr. Tom Clonan has described Shannon as a virtual forward base of the US military. Another thing we can do is to oppose continuous participation in the battle groups of the EU proto-army. Our humanity demands that we oppose imperial war, and it also demands that we offer the hand of friendship and support to those who are fleeing from the resultant carnage. And it is time for us to make sure our voices are heard on that.
Thanks very much for that, Micheal. I'd just like to let everybody know that there's an attendance sheet going around at the moment that you can put your details on, and you'll get information on any future events that are coming up there as well. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our second speaker now. She is Independent TD for Dublin North and former councillor for the Swords local electoral area, Clare Daly. Clare is a consistent opponent to the savage cuts of Fine Gael and Labour, a former shop steward in Aer Lingus for over 10 years. In recent years, Clare has been heavily involved in challenging US military use of Shannon Airport and the failure of authorities and government to investigate violations of international laws there. Breaching the fence at Shannon Airport in order to gain access to military aircraft and prove the presence of military weapons on aircraft passing through Shannon. Clare, along with TD Mick Wallace, are now facing potential prison sentences for their efforts to expose the truth around Shannon Airport. Hand over to you, Clare.
Lovely. Thanks, Megan. And can I just thank the Communist Party for inviting me here today. Very glad to be here, although a little bit sorry that I let Micheal go first now, seeing as he was able to rob all the good points and I don't have any Irish. And Owen has threatened me that I have to stay sitting down, which is not my normal comfort zone. I like to move about and stand up, but anyway, we shall do our best. And I suppose I'll make a few general points about the overall situation and bring it home, and I will pick up the end remarks there in relation to Shannon and maybe some practical points about what we can do in the midst of this international humanitarian crisis. And I suppose the first thing to say is it's incredible, or maybe it isn't, well actually it isn't at all, that a lot of the commentary around these issues at the moment is very much focused on the plight of the refugees, which is obviously horrendous, but very little attention given to why these people are being made refugees in the first place. And I suppose that is the purpose of meetings like this, and it is the most important reason why we're here. And we've been really subjected over the past period, in light of the crisis, to a lot of headlines about Europe's refugee crisis, Europe's migrant crisis, and so on. I suppose the first thing I'd say is, as far as I'm concerned, Europe doesn't have a migrant crisis. The amount of people seeking refuge in Europe is a tiny, tiny percentage of the overall 250 million strong European population. And in actual fact, the crisis is not Europe's. I'd put it the other way around. Migrants and refugees have a European crisis, a crisis caused by Europe and particularly its allies in the United States, who've been the main reason as to why there are so many refugees in the first place, as a result of destabilisation and war, and all of the points that Micheal made as to why people are forced to flee their homes, which is clearly a last resort and the one that nobody takes lightly. And I suppose it's not an exaggeration to say that really throughout history, from the colonial era right up to the present day, it has been the case that Europeans have sailed around the world, or those at the elite of the European establishment, pillaging, stealing, conquering, or facilitating all three, retreating home to count the spoils later on. And then when people whose lives have been destroyed by those antics seek refuge and an attempt to build a better life for themselves in Europe, what do they get? Well, they get fences, they get walls, they get barriers, they get the latest military hardware deployed against them in border patrols, biometrics, border fences topped with barbed wire designed to rip out human fingernails. This is where money is to be made now by the vast security companies that are processing and profiting from this humanitarian disaster. But we all know that repression never works and can't work, because people, it's human beings' instinct to try and survive and build a better lives for themselves. So people will keep doing that regardless of the consequences on themselves. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of people who normally maybe would trundle along getting on with life, there's no doubt there's a lot of pressure on people living in Ireland as a result of the austerity measures being imposed and so on. But it was really, I suppose, the sights on some of the beaches and the horrific pictures from Hungary that jolted a lot of Irish people, maybe out of the sort of numbness that they've had around these issues or something. But while noting that, we should say that these experiences have been everyday experiences for many people in the Middle Eastern region for a whole number of years, because while some of the people fleeing from Syria and so on, even since 2011, into Turkey, into Lebanon, into Jordan in particular, that they maybe thought that they were moving temporarily with a view to moving home in a couple of months or a couple of years and rebuilding their lives and their businesses or their families or whatever. I think that prospect now is becoming elusive for them, and the idea of a permanent move being necessary because of the devastation is very much posed. And I think we should put it in the context of the scale of what we're talking about. There are almost 60 million displaced peoples worldwide, the biggest figure since World War II, which obviously was a massive humanitarian crisis. That if these people were a nation, they would be the 24th largest country in the world. That's the amount of people that we're talking about. And while the European establishment is whinging and moaning, even though they're culpable, let's be clear about it. The so-called or misnamed developing countries, i.e. they're not developing at all, they're the world's poorest and most deprived nations. Actually, 86% of refugees end up in those countries, with the very poorest of the poor taking 25% of refugees. So really, this is a crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis of the economic system that we live in, and very much fuelled and accelerated, as Micheal said, by the role of the Western powers, which since 2001 have actively participated in what they called regime change wars, including in the countries most affected, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and so on, which has directly led to a rise in instability, civil war, collapse of states and a massive displacement of civilian populations. And of course it has been directly responsible for the rise of ISIS. Because if you bomb people in their homes, you deprive their livelihood, do you think that they're going to say, oh, that's okay? Of course not. They're going to look for other ways to deal with that. And I think we do have to start off by saying that the refugees coming to Europe overwhelmingly come from countries which the United States and Europe have had a hand in destabilising, and we too in Ireland, which I'll develop later, through the use of Shannon, are also culpable in. And I think it was very well summed up by James A. Paul, the former director of the New York Global Policy Forum, where he says, official discourse in Europe frames the civil wars and economic turmoil in terms of fanaticism, corruption, dictatorship, economic failures and other causes which they have no responsibility for. They stay silent about the military intervention and regime change in which Europeans were major actors, interventions that have torn the refugees' homelands apart and resulted in civil war and state collapse. And that's the reality of it. And we can talk, there's obviously a knowledge of memos surfacing after the World Trade Center attacks from the Pentagon about how plans to overthrow governments in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia and Sudan and so on. But the reality is that of the countries listed there, two areas, obviously the governments in Iraq and Libya were overthrown, Sudan was cut in half, Somalia is deemed to be the most failed state on earth, and obviously Lebanon and Syria have been completely decimated. And as a result of the interventions, a third of all refugees now come from Iraq and Syria itself. People know the figures, 43% of the Syrian population has been displaced, over 9 million people. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, particularly when we know that these societies were relatively developed. The people had access to food, healthcare, education. Some of them were relatively secular and so on. And what they've been thrown back into is actually beyond horrendous at this stage. And we have a role to play in that. I mean, when you look at the figures, that there are 2.5 million refugees from Afghanistan. And I don't know if people saw the information released through a Freedom of Information request from Shannon Watch there recently about the numbers of permissions sought for arms and soldiers to be transited through Shannon on civilian aircraft. And the figures reveal that last year, almost 200 tonnes of munitions on the way to Afghanistan transited through Shannon. It's an absolute fact that the department released on 6 different trips. Now, we know from Iraq that often that weaponry which originates in the United States ends up in the hands of ISIS or whatever. There's no doubt that some of that weaponry that ended up in the hands of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or whatever probably transited through Shannon. And obviously the military companies in the US don't care, because it just means more of a market that they can, more of a demand. They have to send more if it ends up in the wrong hands in the first place. But I think we have a responsibility to point to situations like that and say that we have a role in that. I think we look at the horrendous situation in Yemen, which hardly gets any focus at all. According to Amnesty and supported by Amnesty, and everybody here obviously knows it, the United States have been actively supporting the Saudi-led air campaign there. And again, through Shannon, there were at least 2 trips last year from the United States to Saudi Arabia. And what does this say for Ireland? We led an international campaign against cluster bombs, get the bans in place. We know cluster bombs are being used in Yemen. There are 8 million children there in dire need of food, shelter, medical treatment and so on. And yet in that sense as well, we too are culpable. And as Micheal says, what we're talking about is the international economic system, capitalism. We're dealing with international, the arms industry, which basically sets the scenes and will do anything to protect its own profits, because there's no point in making these weaponries if nobody's going to be using them. So they're looking for an excuse to do that elsewhere. And I mean, obviously the points have been well made before. It's impossible to become president of the United States without pandering to these absolutely fabulously wealthy vested interests. So they call the shots in terms of what happens next. And that is the era that we live in, which the UNHCR have said means the world is in crisis. So I mean, look, I think here in Ireland, what has the response been? Well, pathetic. I mean, the government's response to everything is pretty much disconnected from the realities that most of us who inhabit the real world are. But, most of the dialogue has been, how do we accommodate these people? And by accommodate, it's a kind of a distortion of the world, because they don't actually mean that. They mean some other form of direct provision set up where they can sort of hurl them in, having made a hames of dealing with that before. And I think it contrasts very much with the reaction of Irish people, which was instinctively to side with the refugees, people offering their homes and so on. And obviously that would be a far better solution to integrate people into Irish society going forward. But I think a huge part of the discourse here has been sort of say that Ireland is another hen party we're competing with now, is it? But you're in a prime location here. You can't really avoid them, But no, I mean, I think a lot of the discourse in Ireland has been to sort of pretend that we're on the sidelines, that we don't have a role in this. It's very little focus. A lot of talk of the cost of this, as if we're just kind of responding out of the goodness of our hearts and we're not involved. And I think that's why we have, and I suppose I will spend a little bit of time on Shannon now, because I think it's critical, and I think we can use this information for good precisely because of the horror of the refugees at the moment. Now, last year there were over 600 permissions given for military US aircraft to land at Shannon. That's almost 2 a day, actually, when it panned out. Separate to that, 55,000 US troops transited through Shannon last year on civilian aircraft. So the typical Irish hypocrisy that's brilliant at dealing with everything. We say the military planes can land because there's nothing on them. They're unarmed, they're not involved in any military exercise, training or whatever. Meanwhile, on civilian aircraft, all the troops are coming in. We're told that their handguns and their weaponry are not on the aircraft, but when we were in court in Ennis earlier this year, both military experts and, for the first time, staff at Shannon Airport who had an intervention with those aircraft gave sworn testimony that they saw handguns and weaponry on top, or up in the cabin where they were supposed to be locked away if they carried them. So we know that troops and weaponry, and in any case, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work this out. 55,000 US troops aren't going on their holidays or taking a break. That's where they're going. They are involved in activity there, and we are culpable on it. And as Micheal said, Tom Clonan has called Ireland a virtual forward airbase of the US military. The Americans themselves, through the WikiLeaks cables, have said Shannon Airport is an important gateway for US commercial and military travel. We have a long-standing arrangement with the Government of Ireland whereby US military aircraft land and refuel at Shannon en route to the Gulf and Afghanistan. Their own words. Later on in 2008, they said Shannon remains a key transition point for US troops and materials bound for the theatres of global war on terror. They go on to say the United States government appreciates, isn't that nice, Ireland's steadfast support in permitting US transits which backstop US actions in the Gulf region. So the Americans themselves are very clear as to what the role of the Irish government is. When we've challenged them in the Dáil about this, and Simon Coveney, who coincidentally happens to be not just the Minister for Defence but the Minister for Agriculture, you might think that's a sort of a misfit, but when we've asked him would the sort of deals on Irish beef have anything to do with the continued use of Shannon, he gets very upset altogether that we might raise the two issues there. So as far as we're concerned, we have a role as Irish citizens to highlight this, and we should. And what can we do? And actually, by us in a practical sense focusing in on some of these things, we can play our role in the global anti-war movement, and we should do that. There's a general election coming. Sadly, we know that in opposition, politicians are very fond of saying, oh yes, US aircraft should be searched, of course they should, it's terrible what's going on and all the rest, and that's even before the latest atrocities, of course, when they've come to power. I'm talking about the Labour Party and the Green Party in particular, who reneged on those commitments and allowed what was going on to continue. We do have now, thankfully, Sinn Féin are on the record and have supported us in some of these calls, but again, we have to make sure that anybody who is thinking of forming a government makes this a red line issue, because it is sufficiently important, more important than many other issues as far as I'm concerned, that this would be dealt with. So I would encourage people to do that. I think people should use the arena of their trade unions and their students' unions to call for support and pressure to be built up in that regard. And obviously there is continued action going on in Shannon in terms of direct action, people seeking to go on and search the aircraft to prove, because when we've raised it in the Dáil over 4 years of the time, nearly 5 now that we've been in there, ministers, particularly Alan Shatter and Eamon Gilmore, have said, oh well, if that's going on, that's desperate, sure, get us the evidence and we look at it. But then of course when the people go and tell the guards to go, they say no, we can't search that, they have sovereign immunity, which is just a complete makey up nonsense. So that direct action is going to continue in Shannon, and with Shannon Watch and so on. I mean, strictly speaking, I suppose you could say we're on the run at the moment in that there isn't, because of us following in the footsteps of Niall Farrell and Margaretta D'Arcy and taking up the advice of Alan Shatter and going to try and search the aircraft to get the ministers the information and evidence they so desperately sought. We were obviously stopped from doing that. Our trial in Ennis over 3 days was unbelievable testimony in terms of proof positive of what's going on in Shannon. We hope to bring that out into a book, that testimony, and really get the word out there, which I think will be important. But because we were fined €2,000 each, and we've no intention of enriching this rotten state by that, we had 3 months to pay. Those 3 months are up since the 22nd of July. So the red letters are getting bigger and bigger. So we are expecting a little knock on the door any day now. So we will be looking for support and using that issue to highlight this crisis. And I suppose tragically, in some ways, the timing is not bad, in that the horror of the refugee crisis is so dominant that we can use that and very much link it back to the situation in Shannon. So, I mean, the last few points I'll make in literally 1 minute. You know, there's always money for war. There's never money for peace. I think, I don't know, people saw Jim Roach from the Irish Anti-War movement did a very good statement last week. I don't think the media picked it up, but it was very good, explaining very clearly how the wealth and resources that are invested in the arms industry could absolutely be invested into giving people a decent life, into resettlement programs and so on throughout Europe, because the response that we need is precisely the type of Marshall Plan, massive state program that happened after World War II. Of course, the US and the EU governments should be ceasing the plunder and the wars that they're engaged in. In the case of Syria, there should be a sit-down talks. All sides should get out and facilitate those in Syria sitting down, a ceasefire and a peace conference there. The US and British and other governments should stop selling arms to the despotic regimes in the Middle East. Of course they should. But are any of these things going to happen with those who are in power at the moment? Not by the hands of those people. The only way in which these things will be stopped is by the mobilisation of ordinary people, in spite of the political establishments who are there in their regions. And I think in an Irish context, what that means is, I mean, if you look at the white paper on defence put forward by Simon Coveney, absolutely frightening, a much greater militarisation of our defence forces. You may have seen the coverage given that Ireland is becoming quite a nice little hub now for military activity and production, component parts rather than finished items. But where are they ending up? And what account? 800 licences issued last year by the Departments of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation for military component contracts, which God knows will end up anywhere. And we should be absolutely focusing in on that. There's a vote in the Dáil on Tuesday, and we weren't even going to get a vote, but I think some people started whinging and giving out. It was going to be just nodded through about Ireland's participation in the next EU battle group as well. We're getting the princely sum of 20 minutes to discuss that and ram it through on Tuesday. So of course there are solutions there. Of course there are resources on a global scale, but the political will isn't there to implement it. And really it's the job of all of us to challenge those in power and wrestle it from them. And I think we can do that both at home and in solidarity with people around the globe. So, with that, yeah.
The blood that's in our veins, the only thing not for sale.